Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about where do you fit John 10 within a 4-gospel chronology. So in some of my previous videos on how I synchronize the 4 gospels, I explained about how there's a loose chronology found within the 4 gospels. And this soft chronology is broken up into 3 main segments. So the first segment was the introduction or the birth of Jesus, all the way through to his water baptism. The second segment is made up of Jesus' 3.5-year ministry. So that is Jesus' water baptism all the way up to Palm Sunday, essentially. And then the third segment is Passion Week, Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. Passion Week consisting of Jesus' triumphal entry when he rode into Jerusalem on the donkey's colt, all the way through to Holy Saturday when he was still in the grave. And then we have the resurrection and the ascension. So I talked about also that the main problem is within that second segment, the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus, that many of the Gospels jumble up the chronology. But we do have the Gospel of John, which is pretty much fully chronological the whole way through. Except the problem is that there's only one story within the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus found in John that's also in the synoptics within this period. And that's the feeding of the 5,000 and then Jesus walking on the water after he was praying up on the mountain. So the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus then walking on the water out to the disciples is the anchor point where all 4 Gospels meet up, somewhere within the mid-range of his 3.5-year ministry. And this is found in John chapter 6. So we can be certain all of the 4 Gospels will meet up with John 6, but for the rest of Jesus' ministry, a little bit of educated guesswork is required. This is because John records many different feast days within this 3.5-year period, including 4 different Passovers, whereas the Synoptic Gospels don't mention any feast days or any dates at all during this period. So the moment Jesus gets in the boat after walking on the water, and then the boat miraculously reaches the shore, we can extend the story of the synchronization all the way through to the end of John 6. Because if you remember, after this it says that the boats that were on the other side of the lake realised Jesus and his disciples weren't there anymore. And so some had come across to see him and they'd missed the miracle. And then they all went back across to Capernaum to find Jesus. And they eventually located him in the synagogue. And then there was a tense discussion between him and all these people. And if you remember, most of Jesus' disciples fled and deserted him because he said some really hard things like, if you want to have life in my name, you have to eat my flesh and you have to drink my blood. And pretty much everyone left except only the 12 disciples loyal enough to stay. And Peter made a bold declaration that he wasn't going anywhere. So then we end up at the beginning of John chapter 7. So now the major question is, where is John going to meet up again with the Synoptic Gospels? Now, when I was doing these previous videos on how I synchronize the Gospels, I gave an overview where I stated that John then meets up again with the Synoptics 6 days before the Passover at the dinner which was held at Simon the leper's house. But to be more precise, this is actually where the Gospels meet up and then travel together from that time onwards. Meaning I could now from that point on utilize John as the basis and foundation for the chronology. But could there be another place where the Gospels intersect? And could this help with our dilemma about the placement of John 10? So after much deliberation and study, I was trying to work out where can we place John 10, and I found a critical juncture. And it's in John 10 verses 39 to 40. And it says this: "Again they tried to seize Jesus, but he escaped their grasp." Verse 40, "Then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days, and there he stayed." So here where we see the phrase back across the Jordan, or onto the other side of the Jordan River, or you could say beyond Jordan, it's the Greek phrase which is peran ha Iordanes. So this is a key phrase that actually lines up with a passage in Matthew. But we also find another clue, and it says it's where John had been baptizing in the early days. Now, Jesus had to flee because the religious leaders were picking up stones to try and kill him, because he just talked about the sheep and how no one can snatch him out of his hand, no one can snatch him out of the Father's hand, and that he and the Father are one. And so because that he was claiming to be God, they were trying to kill him, and so he had to elude their grasp and he had to run away for a time, and he went out across the Jordan to this place where John had been baptizing in the early days, beyond the Jordan, on the other side, just on the east bank there. So then we have this critical verse in Matthew 19 verse 1. First of all, we have part A, where it states that after Jesus had finished saying the things that he was saying in Matthew 18, he departed from Galilee. Now this is significant because he's never to return to Galilee. You never see it mentioned again. This is the final trip towards Jerusalem to die and rise again. And then part B of Matthew 19:1 states that after he departed from Galilee, he came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And there you have the phrase again, beyond the Jordan, 𝗵ραν ha-Ιορδάνες. But then this time you have two other Greek words in front of beyond the Jordan, which is the region of Judea, or ＨORAION UDAIA. And so what this tells us is that the east bank of the Jordan, where Jesus has gone to stay for a while, is adjacent to the region of Judea. It's obviously not in Judea, because Judea is on the west side of the Jordan River, but it's directly adjacent to the region of Judea. And to confirm this fact, we can actually go to the parallel passage in Mark 10 verse 1. Now, Mark doesn't mention anything about Jesus departing Galilee specifically, but he does add one minor detail that is very important. He says this in verse 1. Getting up, Jesus went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. So we see there that Mark's added in the and, because he went into the region of Judea and then across the Jordan and beyond to the other side on the east bank, but it is adjacent. This was indeed where John had been baptizing in the early days, and we can find this out by looking at John 1 verse 28. It says this: these things took place in Bethany beyond the Jordan, where John was baptizing. So here we have the addition of a name of a place called Bethany. So the place is actually called Bethany beyond Jordan. And in our modern world today, this place is known as Al-Magtas. And you can actually go and visit this place today as a tourist destination. And this was actually the place where Jesus was baptized by John. But later on, Jesus and his disciples actually came along and began to water baptize in the Judean countryside. And so John decided to move north to Ainon near Salem, because there was plenty of water there as well. So this was in the Samaria/Galilee region of the Jordan River. So 𝗲𝗏𝗄𝗆 on the east and Samaria on the west. So this was upriver, due north, in between Judea and Galilee. So to confirm these facts, let's just read John chapter 3 verses 22 to 24. After this, Jesus and his disciples went out into the Judean countryside, where he spent some time with them and baptized. At the very same time, John was also baptizing at Ainon near Salem, because there was plenty of water and reasonably high demand. People were still able to come to John for baptism, since he hadn't yet been thrown into prison. So now we're seeing some maps here, and you can see where John baptized Jesus, down south at Bethany beyond Jordan, almost adjacent to Jerusalem. And then we can also see where John moved further north after Jesus' disciples began to water baptize. Then came the statisticians the Pharisees employed to count the number of baptisms that both Jesus and John performed. And they did this even though John had already said to them in John chapter 3 that he didn't care whether Jesus overtook him or not. He actually said, it's my job to decrease and it's Jesus' job to increase. So John had no competitive spirit at all, but yet it didn't stop the Pharisees employing these statisticians to count the number of baptisms between the two. So now I'm going to read the passage that I synchronized together, John 4 verses 1 and 2 with John 3:22. It says this: Jesus realized that the Pharisees had employed statisticians to keep count of the baptisms that he and John performed. Bracket, although his disciples, not Jesus, did the actual baptizing. Close bracket. They relayed the score and Jesus was ahead. Now what's interesting is that the Message translation actually says that by doing this, the Pharisees had actually turned Jesus and John into rivals in the eyes of the people. So what was Jesus' response to this? Here is the next part of the gospel synchronization. Not that this comparison was made for long, because when he found out this was taking place, Jesus moved away from the Judean countryside and stopped baptizing. So we see that after Jesus found out that they were counting the stats and making he and John into rivals, he actually left. He literally left and went to Galilee, and we never have any more record that Jesus ever baptized again after this. So we can conclude that in Matthew 19 verse 1, beyond the Jordan in the region of Judea is definitely 𝗷𝗂𝗪𝗏, Bethany beyond the Jordan. Because Matthew stated here that Jesus departed Galilee, and then Galilee is never mentioned again, we can also conclude that John 10 has to come after Luke 9:51. The verse that states that when Jesus realised it was time for him to ascend to heaven, he set out resolutely with his face fixed towards Jerusalem, never again to return to his homeland of Galilee. So what we find in the Gospel of John is that there's 2 3-month gaps. So there's one between John 6 and John 7, and then there's another one between John 9 and John 10. So in John 6, we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And it states in the Gospel there that it was nearing the time for Passover when Jesus was feeding the 5,000. So we have the Passover there. Then when we get to John 7, it's now the Feast of Tabernacles. So you have Passover around the month of April, and then you have Tabernacles in late September, early October. So there's 3 months. And then in between John 9 and John 10, we have the gap between Tabernacles, and then in John 10, Jesus is going down to the Feast of Dedication, which is called 𝗲𝗃𝗃. And 𝗲𝗃𝗃 is held basically around Christmas time. So that's another 3-month gap between September in Tabernacles and December for the Feast of Dedication, where they celebrate the rededication of the temple, which occurred during the silent years in between Malachi and Matthew. It also makes sense that 𝗲𝗃𝗃 would be after Jesus has left Galilee for the final time, as John never mentions that Jesus ever went back to Galilee after this time, and also because it was only 3 months before Jesus was going to be crucified on April the 3rd, 33 AD. But the most compelling evidence that Jesus never returned to Galilee is that the Gospels show us the places where he stayed from that time onwards. He stayed first just outside of Judea on the east bank of the Jordan River, as I've already found out, in 𝗷𝗂𝗪𝗏, Bethany beyond Jordan, and that's John 10:40. Secondly, after he raised Lazarus from the dead, Jesus was forced to go out to a remote country village named Ephraim, and he stayed there for a little while until Palm Sunday. And then after Palm Sunday, we read in the Synoptic Gospels that of an evening, Jesus would leave the temple grounds, he would teach there every day, and then every night he would ascend back up onto the Mount of Olives to stay at Bethany, where Lazarus, Mary and Martha lived. So you have 2 Bethanies. You have the Bethany where Lazarus and Mary and Martha lived, which is on top of the Mount of Olives, and then you have the Bethany beyond Jordan, which is on the east bank of the Jordan River. So now we have these 2 3-month gaps to work with. The one in between John chapter 6 and 7, and the other one in between John chapters 9 and 10. I decided to work on the assumption that Jesus wouldn't stay away from home for 3 months at any one time until the end of his life. But I'm by no means being dogmatic. After all, it is only an assumption. So wherever a 3-month gap occurs, I tried to emphasize this in the synchronized translation, which would spread out the Gospel of John throughout the text more evenly. The gap between John 6 and 7 is very easy to conclude that this is the case, because in John 7:1 part A, it says, "After this, Jesus travelled around Galilee." And it also states that he was purposely staying away from Judea because the religious leaders were trying to kill him. But in the end, Jesus did have to go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. So after much deliberation, I chose to place John 7 immediately after Jesus' transfiguration and the healing of the demon-possessed boy with the epileptic seizures. From here, Jesus goes to Jerusalem and remains there throughout John chapter 7, 8 and 9. So then the main question becomes, does John 10 come straight after John 9, or can we include other activities from other Gospels within this gap of 3 months? That's the gap between Tabernacles and Hanukkah. Namely, does Jesus return to Galilee one final time after the Feast of Tabernacles and then comes back down to Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication? It's impossible to know for sure, but we have to make some kind of informed decision here. So because I'm working on the assumption that Jesus wouldn't stay away from home for an entire 3 months, I have Jesus going back to Galilee one final time and then coming back down into Judea in late December and then remaining around the periphery in those 3 destinations I mentioned earlier until the end of March in 33 AD when he rides in on the donkey. The key to me coming to this conclusion is we know where he stayed after Hanukkah. We have those 3 places. It informs us in the Bible the places Jesus stayed. But in between 9 and 10, in between Tabernacles and Hanukkah, from September to December, nothing's mentioned about where Jesus stayed. So I would presume that that means Jesus went back home. Therefore, I tentatively placed chapters 7 to 9 in John a little bit earlier on, even though it's not certain whether Jesus went back home after Tabernacles this one last time. Then I had to place John 10 after Luke 9:51, which, if you recall, was the point where Jesus begins to trek from Galilee towards Jerusalem for the final time. So if we shift our focus now onto this final trip that Jesus made from Galilee, where he departed there for the last time and went down into Jerusalem, we see that Luke has extensive coverage of this trip. It literally lasts all the way from chapter 10 through to chapter 18, so he covers it extensively. John gives us a brief insight to some of the things that happen in John 10, which is where Jesus is in Jerusalem and he's speaking about himself as the Good Shepherd and the sheep in the sheep pen. But then Matthew and Mark don't include anything about this trip at all. If you recall in Matthew 19 verse 1, it says that Jesus departed from Galilee, and then in part B of the exact same verse, he's already gone into the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, to the place where John was baptizing in the early days. So they don't cover it at all. Luke has 9 chapters full, and John has 1 chapter that covers this period of time. So where does Luke end up meeting back with Matthew and Mark? Well, it's actually the story, which is event number 159 in Jesus' life, in the Gospel synchronization. It's Jesus blessing the children. And this is found in Luke 18, verse 15. So that's where they meet up. And then from here, it goes on to another story that all 3 of the synoptics cover, which is the rich young ruler, which is the next story after the divorce discussion found in Matthew and Mark. Now, to introduce John 10 into the chronology, we have to choose a spot in Luke somewhere between chapters 10 and 18. Because Luke doesn't mention Jesus going beyond the Jordan to where John was baptizing in the early days, like the other 3 do. So where did I end up choosing and why? I chose to bring John 10 in after Luke 13 verse 17. And the reason behind this decision is that just after this in Luke chapter 13 verses 31 to 35, Jesus talks about heading to Jerusalem with a real sense of finality. So let's examine these verses now. Verse 31 says, "At that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, 'Leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you.' Jesus replied, 'Go tell that fox, look here, I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the 3rd day I will reach my goal. In any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones to death those I send her. Many times I wanted to gather up your people as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you wouldn't let me. Look, your house is being left to you alone. Listen carefully. You will not see me again until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Jesus' language here is, I'm going there to die imminently, probably within a week or so. More so than I'm going there for Hanukkah, then I'm going to hang around the periphery for another 3 months. It seems like Jesus is referring to his triumphal entry. Go tell that fox, I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will reach my goal. And another party says, surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. These are statements of finality, of imminency. Today, tomorrow, and the third day. Our Lord is saying in effect, my time is not to be settled by Herod. It is definite and it is short. So that's my reasoning as to why I decided to place the chapter of John 10 before Luke 13, verses 31 to 35. But once again, I'm by no means being dogmatic about this. John 10 could have been inserted anywhere up to Luke 17 or even perhaps 18. And when I did include John chapter 10, to help with the flow of the chronology, I did actually have to bring verse 22 of John 10 up to the top and begin with that verse. So it actually starts with John 10 verse 22, then goes verse 1 through to 21, and then after that 23 through to 40. Verse 22 is where John states that it was winter and Jesus was attending the Feast of Dedication. Because the conversation about the sheep, which took place from verses 1 through 21, continues on after verse 22, it is reasonably safe to presume that the entire chapter of John 10 happened around the same time or potentially even on the same day. That's my opinion anyway. So that's why I did that, and it helped with the flow of the chronology because you had to bring John chapter 10 in after the synoptics had been the main source of the narrative for many chapters previous. So then after claiming to be God, when he stated that no one can snatch him out of his hands or the Father's hands and that he and the Father are one, throughout verses 23 through to 38, the religious leaders pick up stones to try and stone Jesus. And then after making one more brief point about why he should be called the Son of God, Jesus eludes their grasp and escapes out to Bethany beyond the Jordan. From here, Jesus seems to travel back across the Jordan and out into Samaria almost as far north as the border of Galilee. And that's Luke 17:11 if you read that verse, where he heals the 10 lepers. So they had to be on the outskirts, people with leprosy, and also one of them was a Samaritan, remember? So he's definitely in the area where the Samaritans were living. Then after this, Jesus comes back down, heading back into Judea towards Bethany on the Mount of Olives where Lazarus was laying dead in the tomb. If you remember, Jesus says, let's go back to Judea now. And then his disciples say, but a short time ago the Jews were trying to stone you there when you were talking about, you and the Father are one. But Jesus said, aren't there 12 hours of light when a man can walk? So now he goes back and raises Lazarus out of the tomb. And so now he's really infuriated the high priest and all the religious leadership. And so he has to be forced out and withdraw to that little country village in the outskirts of Judea called Ephraim. Then, as the time approaches for his fourth and final Passover, Jesus ventures back briefly to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, and then across to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives to pick up the mother donkey and her colt, and then rides down the hill on that colt into Jerusalem for his triumphal entry. Now, you might be interested, the name Bethphage signifies the house of unripe figs, and Bethany means the house of dates, and Gethsemane is the oil press. These three names obviously indicate local features giving distinctiveness to these three sites, even though they're all on top of the Mount of Olives. So then after entering Jerusalem on the colt, Jesus teaches daily in the temple courts and then withdraws each evening to stay at Bethany on the Mount of Olives throughout his Passion Week. So there you have it, people. I hope you've gleaned some new insights from this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and now you'll see some other relevant videos pop up on the end screen. Catch you next time.